So I've been using UNRAID now for quite some time, probably about 3 months, something like that. So I thought I'd kind of revisit some of the things I found and some of my sort of thoughts on it in general. So I'm really liking it. I find it is it's quite good fun to play around with as a sort of an additional server. So I still don't use it as my main things like media server, and I have a computer that's also a web server, and that computer also does own cloud, or Nextcloud as the fork. So I don't use it for that because that system's sort of nicely set up and has been running more or less unchanged for probably about 5 years, except the hardware has been slowly upgraded. Eventually I will have to retire that, and there will be a question as well of, do I sort of move everything over to UNRAID, or do I keep that sort of Debian system? Because it could easily, UNRAID has the capacity to do things like Plex servers and whatever. But for now, this is a nice secondary backup system, and I do copy all of the important data from my own cloud onto this system, as well as an encrypted storage space, backup for videos for teaching, and it provides the time machine backups for 2 fairly old laptops now. So yeah, it's a nice system, and it's very easy to use, and it's pretty stable. I've not had any trouble with any of the system or parts of the system that I've been using at all, really. But I have found a few things. So one, that flexibility does kind of invite you to use it for stuff, which is not really surprising. So my original system had a dual core low power Athlon 2. It was I think a 260U, which was 25 watts. That was insufficient even for using like rsync backups. So rsync would regularly max out both of those cores, and then the performance of the server was not very good really, and the backups would take a long time. So I underestimated really how much performance the rsync would require. So that was one thing that I'd noticed. So what I did was I had an old X4 605E, which is clocked slightly higher than the 260U at 2.3 gigahertz instead of 1.8. Does use a bit more power, but not a lot. Now that would probably be enough if I was just using it as a backup, essentially kind of storage, as I found that it could cope now with the rsync demands reasonably well. However, as I said, this system and RAID does invite you to start using other things. So I've actually started playing with virtual machines. So I have a number of small computers doing bits and bobs, one of which I used as a Pi-hole. So I had a Raspberry Pi, and that was running Pi-hole, which, if you've not heard of, is a way of filtering out adverts from your web surfing. So it acts as a DNS server that you can connect to optionally, and then it'll remove adverts, and they update the system to help it do that. So it's really good. I don't use it all the time, but it's useful sometimes if you don't want to be bothered with adverts. And then the other VM I use or had around the place was to do things like maybe testing websites, or other kind of just sort of having a machine that you could spin up to do a specific task that you maybe didn't want to configure like one of my servers that was nicely configured. I might not want to experiment with a new piece of software or whatever it might be. So I often used VMs for that. So I'd have VMs on different machines that would be for testing things, or messing about with something, or just playing with the configuration of something. So it struck me as it's quite nice to have these on UNRAID, because it has this facility to have and manage VMs, and then you can log into them either via VNC or SSH. I tend to use SSH prefer that, particularly as I tend to run things headless in VMs. So that use case puts obviously more demands on things like memory and CPU. So these two VMs, they're actually running now, but I don't think they're doing very much. I mean, Pi-hole never really requires very much resources. It is a bit of a faff to get it working in a VM, by the way, but it is possible. And that other VM, I think, is probably not doing anything right now. So you can see that it's the RAM usage and the CPU usage of the system as it is quite low. I think the load average of this system is probably pretty high, though, due to, as soon as those things start doing something, or they're doing something and I'm also doing a backup, it regularly max out 4 cores now. So I've been thinking what to do. Because I like the system, I've decided that it's probably worth just to kind of investing in some different hardware. And it's also good fun, right? I quite like building and messing about with computers. So I've got an idea of running a low power, high core count Xeon system as my UNRAID system. And one of the nice things about UNRAID is that it's relatively easy to swap out hardware. So I'll just be able to shut the system down, swap all the motherboard, processor around, plug all the hard drives back in, put the USB stick in, and then it should just go back pretty much straight as it was before. Or at least that's what I understand to be the case. It'll be a good test, because before this system becomes too embedded in what I'm doing, I can test how easy it is to change and replace those bits of hardware. Hopefully I won't lose any data, but if I did, I'd be losing backups rather than anything new. So it would make me slightly vulnerable for a little while to data loss elsewhere, but I wouldn't actually lose anything. Particularly my other server that backs up partly to this system also backs up to an offsite backup as well. So that would be relatively secure still. But I would lose backups of my videos, but hopefully that would be okay. And to be honest, if I did lose something, that's, those videos are also stored on things like YouTube or the teaching system, so it wouldn't be the end of the world, basically. Yeah, so that's my plan. It is interesting that, these things, once you get into them, you see their potential, and then you start spending money that perhaps you didn't intend to do. Obviously, it's optional. I don't have to upgrade this thing, but I'm kind of interested in doing it. One other VM actually that I'd quite like to run is RStudio. So there are Dockers and various apps that you can put into this. You can run RStudio out of a Docker, I think, but actually I think I prefer just to run it out of a reasonably low spec VM instead, because I think that's probably easier. But judging by what I saw, the configuration of the Docker, it looked like it might be easier just to run it out of a VM, which is fine. And RStudio is something I use for work, so that'd be quite useful. The other thing that I'm interested in exploring as well is just, there's all sorts of apps in here, and it would be quite interesting to kind of to play with some of them. And I think as I start installing and running more of those things, it's going to put more demands on this system that really is probably not up to it. So that's sort of the rationale really of moving over to a lowish power but high core Xeon. So the system that I'm looking at is 12 cores, 24 threads, and the chips draw about 50 watts, I think. So still be relatively good. And I've managed to find 64 gigabytes of RAM to start with. So that's quite a lot of RAM, and that should make it much better for running these VMs. I think in terms of the VMs that I'm running, their demands will be more on the RAM side rather than the CPU side in general. So each time you add a VM, you have to sort of allocate a base amount of RAM. So it does sort of start limiting things quite quickly. Yeah, so once I get the parts, so far I have the memory and the CPUs are on the way. And then I'm looking at a motherboard a suitable motherboard off eBay. So once I've got all those things sorted out, I will do a video showing you what I'm intending to do. I need to find a cooler as well, I think. But yeah, so summary really. Very impressed with UNRAID. I've been fiddling with it a bit, so the uptime's quite low at the minute, but it ran solidly for at least 2 months without any interruptions at all. So that's really good. Okay, well, thanks, and I will keep you updated.